surveys show a third of election workers have received some kind of threat, 1/3, and 1/6 have either left or seriously considered leaving their jobs because of this, right? And so that's also a huge part of the chilling effect that seizes up the machinery of a functional democracy. I'll start with a few thoughts. So one thing that we know is that Americans are overwhelmingly opposed to political violence. So in various surveys, like from the voter study group, something like 90% of Americans say that they're opposed to political violence. But at the same time, if you ask people, do you feel that political violence is justified sometimes to achieve political ends, an increasing number of Americans say yes. So in some surveys, and this has been increasing since about 2015, 2016, and now in recent surveys, something like 30% of Democrats and 30% of Republicans say that there are some conditions under which violence would be justified to advance their political ends. And then the third thing we know is that though about equal numbers or percentages of Democrats and Republicans say that political violence would be sometimes justified, in recent years, most of the actual political violence in the United States has been coming from the right. And that hasn't always been the case. If you go back a decade or two, the preponderance of political violence was coming from the left in eco-terrorism and to advance ecological kinds of objectives. But so those are a few of the kind of stylized facts.
I think we really have to talk about different kinds of violence or what we mean by violence.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, a lot of the recent conversation was precipitated by the assassination attempt on former President Trump, and that's one kind of violence. What happened on January 6th was another. And I think that it's very important to distinguish, for example, between violence which is intended to harm people as opposed to what's often called violence, which is trying to cause property damage.
Yeah.
Towards forceful actions that are designed, you know, or random violence, for example, you know, so a true terrorist act where you try to frighten the civilian population.
Yes.
I think that those distinctions are very, very important.
Yeah.
And then as the historian in this large group, I mean, I think that we find that the incidence of different kinds of violence and the types of violence has varied a lot historically. So I think we have to be careful about that. I mean, I certainly think it's true that in recent years there is a greater tolerance of politicized violence.
Yes.
Coming particularly from the right.
Yes.
I urge caution about generalizations.
I agree. Were you surprised that there was an assassination attempt on President Trump, former President Trump?
If you had asked me to predict in advance, I probably would have said it was more likely that there would have been an attempt on President Biden. On Biden,
yes.
than on Trump. But you know, again, we're talking about different or what the origins are. The assassination attempt on President Trump. One of the interesting things is we know precious little about this shooter,
and may not know anymore.
We may not ever know more.
Kind of amazing.
But that incident struck me as being more akin to school shootings than to politicized assassination attempts. Yes. I mean, this struck, you know, again, from the very little we know, this is a very, very troubled young man. So I think that, again, there's a certain kind of violence that may come from people who are really disturbed, you know, in some way, and I think that was the case with the Trump assassination.
Yeah, I think, you know, the topic is political violence, and that term for many people means violence used as an instrument to accomplish political objectives. You know, so if you take that definition, it makes a little hard to reckon the assassination attempt on Donald Trump and the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, right? Because I think in both of those, the political consequences would have been, you know, quite palpable. I think if the assassination attempts had been successful, or even if they weren't, I think the political consequences are are very, very palpable, but the intention doesn't seem to be political in either of those cases, unlike the assassination of Jack Kennedy or of Abraham Lincoln or William McKinley.
Right. Or to refer to, again, to bring in a different type, or to the blowing up, the explosion in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, right.
Which did have a purpose.
Political objective.
A political objective. So
yeah.
that I think I asked my class a couple of years ago after January 6th, I asked the students in my class whether they would have been willing to engage in forcible demonstrations if they thought the election had been.
What do you mean by, what did they mean by forcible?
Well, if they thought that the election had been stolen from their candidate. I mean, I was trying to see whether there was any potential way of, that they could sympathize, with people. And, they had difficulty with the question, because in a way they knew that they shouldn't want to do that, but they could kind of imagine themselves doing it. Now, again, there's the forcible question. Is a sit down that blocks the doors of a building of political violence? Now, I would say no. I would say no. It could be forcible, but it wouldn't be violent.
Yes.
And I think that I think that at one, look, at one extreme we have the random school shooter kind of person, right? And I think Hinckley with Ronald Reagan kind of falls into that category.
I mean, that's what my understanding is. Yeah.
Right. And then we have the directly politicized, assassinations. But then there's a range of other, and this is kind of where I would like to lead us in the conversation, or take us for at least a few minutes. There's a range of other kinds of violent acts that do have political purposes, and one of those purposes is intimidation.
Yes.
Right? I mean, like acts that were taken against poll workers in the 2000 election and the 2022 elections.
Yes.
Now, those are not as dramatic. They don't get the kind of headlines that trying to shoot a president does. But I think that may be a more widespread and potentially more dangerous kind of political violence, and I think there may be a lot of tolerance of that.
Yeah. So I know as a historian, sometimes you resist the general categories that I construct for you. But so I kind of think about political violence in three different categories. And the first is the organized bottom-up political violence of the Timothy McVeigh character. He's one of the people who blew up the Edward Murrah building in Oklahoma City, and that was very deliberate. He was an active member of a network of militia organizations that had a large degree of antipathy toward the federal government, and he blew up the Murrah building, killing many civilians. So that's a pretty clear category. And we've seen lots of that in U.S. history and in other places. And a second category is, and many people, I think, don't think about this as political violence, but it's violence coming from the state for political ends. So when the government security forces in Bangladesh over the last 3 or 4 weeks put down demonstrations resulting in probably 200 or 300 protesters getting killed, I consider that political violence too, but just from the top down. And then a third category of political violence is what some people have called stochastic violence, which is probabilistic. And the idea there is that the political environment is heated up. People say that political leaders say things. They endorse forceful means of accomplishing political ends, or at least don't condemn those ends. And then oftentimes young men with poor impulse control engage in violent acts. And sometimes it's like a school shooting. It's like the Hinckley or the Thomas Matthews case. But then sometimes I think that the stochastic category, the probabilistic category, is mixed in a little bit with the bottom-up category. So the violence and intimidation of election workers, from secretaries of state on down to the volunteer at the polling place, I think it's between those two. It's not like, oftentimes, it's not like the Timothy McVeigh case where people are in a basement or a cabin with a map and planning things out. It's that somebody says the election is stolen or the game is rigged, and other people, that makes them really mad, or they have a bad day and they make a phone call. Maybe it's a bomb threat. Maybe it's just a threat to someone or their family, or saying something really ugly. And so things are heated up, and in a kind of decentralized way, an individual way, people are doing things that does have this effect. So before I came over here, there was a story that ran in the paper, and in Maricopa County, the public schools are resisting using schools as polling places now, because the last election there was so much of this static that you're talking about that now they're really worried. So it has an effect.
Well, you may be surprised about this, but I think that your three categories are actually very, I think it's very useful. I mean, the stochastic category, the things are heating up, is the most elusive in a way.
Yes.
It's difficult to define, but it may be more important than some of the others. I mean, I think, and I think another example comes to my mind about this, about the effects of that kind of violence or threatened violence or the temperature rising up, was that in a recent biography of Mitt Romney, Romney commented that he thought that there were a number of senators who did not vote for conviction of Trump in the second impeachment hearings because they feared violence against themselves and their families. Now, that kind of intimidation is pernicious, in a political system, and if political leaders are taking steps because of fears, apprehensions about their own political safety, of their families or their staff members, that's something about the current climate, in the United States that I find deeply worrying.
Yes. I think I completely agree. And I think that the chilling effect occurs at the very top, from the Senate and the Congress all the way down to school councils and select boards. And so I think we know that every member of Congress has received some kind of threat and intimidation, kind of notes and messages recently. And you might think, well, they're public figures, they signed up for it. But then it kind of goes all the way down. So, Alex and I sit in the Ash Center. We sit in the Ash Center at the Kennedy School. I've been here almost 25 years. But this year, several of our faculty members received these kinds of ugly threats on social media and on email. And so we've installed panic buttons. We have security cameras. We did an active shooter and threat training for faculty and staff. And in my 24 years at the university, I never imagined until last semester that we'd have to do anything like that. So, and I think our faculty, it's a stretch to say that any faculty member is brave, but I think we have a certain level of privilege that makes the chill, somewhat less. But then other people's, I think most people don't have to go far. You talk to somebody probably your friend on a school board or on the city council, and they've received things. And certainly almost every surveys show 1/3 of election workers have received some kind of threat, 1/3, and 1/6 have either left or seriously considered leaving their jobs because of this, right? And so that's also a huge part of the chilling effect that seizes up the machinery of a functional democracy.
Right, and and a number of election boards are having trouble recruiting people.
Yeah.
I mean, just one personal anecdote about this not being altogether new is that I was doing a lot of media commentary in the wake of the 2000 election, or especially in the 3 to 4 weeks between the election and when it was resolved by the Supreme Court. There was one day when I was in a radio studio doing a show for NPR. I forget where, and And I don't even remember exactly what I said, but it was probably, I mean, I'm sure it was pro-democratic blather of one sort or another. And by the time I got back to my office, which was maybe a 10-minute walk from the studio, there were threatening messages on my voicemail, including one, and it was
in the 2000?
In the 2000 election.
Wow.
Including one which was memorable because it was the week before Thanksgiving, said, we're going to get you, but I hope that first you choke to death on your turkey.
Wow.
And that was, I experienced that as chilling.
Yes.
Right?
It's a direct threat.
Yeah, and I think people go through that all the time.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the temperature rising, I mean, the period which comes most to mind for me is the 1850s, the decade before the Civil War. There you had a celebrated instance of a physical attack on a member of the Senate by another member of the Senate.
With a cane.
With a cane.
Yeah.
That left him in the hospital
Yeah.
for a while. That could have a chilling effect. On the outside, you had, in addition to many other things, but you had a war going on, basically a civil war going on in Kansas over whether the state was going to be admitted as a free state or a slave state. And in effect, they tried to have elections, but there were armed groups of vigilantes on both sides who were fighting, and it was really all being decided by force and violence.
Yeah.
And the federal government seemed largely incapable. And the temperature was raised during that decade in such a way that it's not that I wouldn't say that it made the Civil War seem inevitable, but it certainly didn't make it seem surprising to people.
With the historical perspective, does that make you feel more sanguine and calm about our current moment? I mean, we don't. So Lincoln, the week before he gave his first inaugural, had to sneak into Washington under cover of night because there was a rumor of an assassination plot. After Reconstruction ended, there are bands of armed auxiliaries to white supremacists in state governments suppressing left and right. That feels more elevated as a level of violence than now. And even in the 1960s with Red Army faction in Europe, the Weather Underground here, that was felt a little bit more like the Timothy McVeigh, kind of organized kinds of political violence. So it feels like we're not seeing that level of, so do you feel okay about where we are given?
No, I mean, I don't find consolation in history in that regard.
Oh, okay.
I mean, particularly, when I look at what happened in the 1850s, it did lead to civil war.
It did.
And the country was so polarized, and polarization in itself, I don't think, is necessarily a danger or a source of violence. But when the polarization is strongly felt and is believed to be about issues that you can't compromise.
Yes.
Like slavery.
Existential.
Right.
Our whole economy will fall apart if the slaves are free.
Right. And, and indeed precisely the issue in Kansas and Nebraska, as it had been for half a century in the United States, was could we find a compromise about slavery? Could we have, slavery in some places and not in others as the country expanded? I mean, that was a lot of the political history of the years from 1800 to the outbreak of the Civil War, and the answer in the end was no.
Yeah.
That you couldn't compromise this, and there were very strong sentiments, to say the least, on both sides, and then. After the war, as the violence continued in the South, and it was very violent. I mean, if you were black, you learned very quickly to, not to speak your piece and not to try to vote eventually. That calmed down only because of repression, significant repression and fear, and the federal government's tolerance of the South becoming a white supremacist region.
Yes.
That looked much more like parts of Russia than it did like the rest of the United States.
Yes.
So I don't feel, when I follow that historical thread and I look at the present, I mean, yes, of course, we haven't, I don't see a civil war happening. But I don't readily see how we move past the levels of polarization and the threats about violence that exist in our current climate.
I wonder, I mean, there are obviously great dangers in historical analogies, for sure.
Historical analogies are good for posing questions, not for giving answers.
Very good. Given the Civil War analogy, I'm a little bit at a loss for what the polarization that we're confronting today is really about. So I do know that surveys tell us that 90% of Democrats view Republicans as a fundamental threat to the nation and democracy. And the converse is true as well. 90% of Republicans view Democrats as a threat to the nation's well-being and to democracy. But unlike the Civil War era, in which slavery was, a fundamental, it was about a way of life, about a whole political economy. The South would have to fundamentally restructure if slavery were to end, and after it did end. And even the Vietnam era, where it had a similar, or not that similar, a different existential feel. The Vietnam War, there was a draft. Many people were going and many dying, and then many others objected to what they felt was an unjust war, which was, there was a reality to that. And today's political polarization is very deeply felt, but for me it's hard to identify an issue or a set of concrete issues that grounds that division.
Well, I mean, one of the common answers, is that it is about race and ethnicity, and about the society becoming less and less predominantly white, and that many people feel that that's a loss. I mean, there are Christian nationalists and white supremacists in the country. I think, I don't think, I mean, and I agree with you that what's going on recently, is very different, and I don't want to overdo the analogy. But I would be remiss not to mention that if you look at electoral maps of the United States from 2000 to 2020, they look exactly like the electoral maps of 1854, 1860, right. only with the parties switched.
Yeah, right.
And somehow that doesn't seem to be a coincidence. And it suggests that race and racial stratification remain critical to the polarization that exists in our current world. But I agree. I don't see one line of cleavage. I mean, I think race is there, and it's there as something.
It plays out in these very complicated ways.
It plays out in very complicated ways, and I think that there are class issues that are insufficiently addressed, except somehow the Democratic Party thinks addressing it is we've got to get more white working class voters. Well, I'm sure that's true, but how do you do that once the Democratic Party in the late 19th century, in some sense, separated itself from the labor movement and separated itself from various social welfare programs that became more difficult. I also think, this is just it's almost a methodological aside, but I note this anyway, that the people that are referred to in common journalism discourse as white working class, I'm not sure quite fit the classic definition of that. When I went through and I had a student going through who the people were who participated in the January 6th events, because at least we have very good records about those who were arrested.
Yeah, we know.
And we know who they were, and they were certainly not college educated, and some were, but many were not, and they were certainly white, but they tended to be small entrepreneurs rather than a classic definition of workers. They tended to be somebody who owns a small roofing company or who owned a bar. who owned a small shop, a small business. And that has always been understood to be sociologically and politically a segment of society that's very different from the working class.
Yes, yes, yes. Petit bourgeoisie.
Right.
What are insights from any of these periods of elevated violence? First, how to mitigate the violence and contain it when it's occurring, and then how to resolve it in the medium and longer term. So, Lincoln's first inaugural, the mystic chords of memory, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. And then a couple months later, the Civil War breaks out. So his hopes were not. So what do we know in any of these periods about how to contain? I know what people are saying now about what we should do, or a few of the things, but I don't actually have any thoughts about whether or not those things will work.
Nor do I. In some sense, again, taking the late 19th century as an example, the violence was contained by passing laws that served the same objectives as the violence. So if initially you got voter suppression by the Klan going around, riding around and saying, if you vote, we'll burn down your farm or we'll shoot you, and you had lots of actual repression going on like that. Well, by 15 years later, you
have laws saying you can't vote.
Exactly. Or you have the white primary. Says you have to be white to vote in the Democratic Party, and there was no Republican Party in the South. So that was that. But that's,
and on the other side, Reconstruction is the Union Army imposing
its will.
Imposing its will.
Right.
So one side wins is one resolution. That's a little bitter pill to swallow, right there.
One side wins and then withdraws its troops, withdraws its armed forces, and then the other side wins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, neither of those is offering us much in the way of a guideline for
reconciliation or conciliation.
Right. I mean, I think that you're pointing to the absence of one clear issue or dividing line behind our current levels of polarization. Is also, that's also behind why it's so difficult to imagine resolutions, right, or settlements. But and there are issues. I mean, for example, there are social issues, and I would even I would include the right to abortion in this, or some people have deep religious convictions. And that can be the same thing we said about gay marriage or a number of the other hot button and important issues. And some people have very strong religious or values, views about this, which are not the same as mine, and would lead them to act in ways that would not be the way that I would act. But the question I think we have to ask is, can those differences be tolerated in a society where, as long as the views, the attitudes, the values of some group of people is not being imposed on others?
Yeah.
Can you tolerate that difference? And I don't think we exactly know how to get to that.
The Civil War analogy is that the nation is divided and there are two roughly equal sides. And whether or not, whatever, two forceful sides that aren't going away easily unless there's some conciliation or one side wins and one side loses. And that's kind of how I see the current polarization myself. But other people talk about it, I think, somewhat differently, in that there's an outlaw and an anti-institutional, much smaller group, and if you could just get rid of them, then things would be okay. So I see the effort to disqualify Donald Trump from running out on the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment as that kind of move, as there's an outlaw anti-institutional fraction, and if you could just contain that, then things would be okay. And you don't need any big conciliation or big social shift or anything like that. Do you think that one or other of those pictures is closer to the truth?
I don't know. Do you? Do you? I mean,
It feels more divided to me. Yeah. I don't buy the outlaw faction kind of view.
You know, I mean, you know, another more simplistic version of that is, you know, if Trump went away in one fashion, you know, or another, would the MAGA movement continue?
Yeah, I think it probably would.
And
I
agree.
I think it's a real, political force. Yeah.
And again, these are cliches, but people are walking around with very different kinds of information in their head to, you know, to justify the antagonisms that they feel, and you know, and you don't know whether, you know, they were just receptive to misinformation. I mean, I saw an interview somewhere. It might have been on Twitter or something. But I saw a dialogue just yesterday. But it was an interview. It was a reporter interviewing a couple of people at a MAGA rally, who were insisting that in California it was now legal to perform abortions up to 4 weeks after birth.
That would be infanticide.
which meant that you could kill a child up to 4 weeks after they had been born. And they were insisting that they had read that this was legal.
Yeah.
And I have no idea where they got that misinformation, but it's hard to dislodge that.
Yeah, for sure. And in the wake of the assassination attempt, I think you saw people made up terms for this: blue MAGA and blue pills, right. Something like, I forget what the faction is, but a large percentage of Democrats were willing to entertain the thought that the assassination attempt was staged. Right. A fairly big portion, bigger than I would have thought. Yeah. Right. So it kind of reinforces. You know, one thing that people say about how to quell or at least turn down the temperature is that political leaders need to step up and reinforce norms against political violence. And, you know, that seems very commonsensical. And I was listening to a talk by a scholar of political violence recently, and her view was that the courageous conservative speaking up doesn't really do much good. So if you have the Liz Cheneys or the Mitt Romneys standing up and saying, you know, this political violence of January 6th is outrageous, that's actually not that helpful, because they, or Jeff Flake's, become quickly ostracized from what is now the bulk of the Republican Party. And then every other Republican says, I don't have anything like the pedigree of Liz Cheney, and she's way conservative than I am on any policy issue. And if she can be ostracized and her political future ended within the party, then I'm certainly not going to speak up. And so the scholar's view was what you needed was more groups of conservatives standing up to enforce norms against political violence rather than courageous individuals. And I thought that hadn't occurred to me, that like the individual courage may not be the most helpful thing, even though it's very satisfying to see.
It also suggests that the pathway out of our current politically acrimonious world, if there is a pathway out, will have a lot to do with what the fate of the Republican Party is over the next 10 to 20 years. And that's, you know, that's a little bit hard to tell whether there will be. I mean, I think Liz Cheney and some of the people that she is linked to are in some sense hoping that that Joe Biden or Kamala Harris will win the next election, and that then they will have the political space to create a center-right party that is separate from the Republican Party.
Yeah,
and, you know, as it exists now.
Do you think it is plausible to have a Republican Party and a Democratic Party in their current forms with, you know, something like their current policy positions and differences on race, on immigration, all these issues, on economic issues, although it's a little hard to tell what those differences are these days, that the positions are the same, but that the violence gets turned down because leaders eschew nonviolence? Or do you think, no, the differences, the gap in the differences itself is such that there will be an increased turned up violence? That is, can we have the same positions and say, yeah, we're going to work this out peacefully even though we disagree fundamentally? Or does the fact that we disagree fundamentally mean that, at least on the edges and maybe much more than that, it's going to come to blows?
My inclination, I should toss that question back to you and make you answer it, and maybe I will, but my inclination is that the first scenario, which is to, somehow let these differences persist but lower the temperature.
Yeah, right.
And say, we can negotiate on this.
Yeah.
Like on the border, Senator Langford's proposal on the border, which was a compromise, which Trump rejected. But, can we, not everybody gets what they want, but it's enough, and, and then people don't have to scream and shout at each other, et cetera. I think that's a plausible kind of scenario around a number of issues. What concerns me, or what makes me less optimistic about that, the world's a pretty unpredictable place.
Yes.
We don't know exactly what the challenges are that are going to be coming our way and that are going to tap into, these kinds of cleavages. I mean, let's take the pandemic as an example, right? It's something that we, right?
I thought that would be unifying,
but it wasn't.
I was clearly wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's precise. But it was an example of something that was a major threat, and a politicized major threat, which nobody saw coming, right? 2018, nobody was talking about. And there are other things going on in the world that could come home to roost for us. I mean, we talk about, for example, we talk about the Middle East as a tinderbox, which could explode at any time, and that's certainly true. And I think for most Americans that's true, and they may have strong feelings about it, but it seems pretty far away. But sometimes those things can bounce back, and really have impacts.
Yes.
And so I guess where I'm going with that is that we would have to have a lot of experience of successful negotiation of different views and successful compromise, building up a whole lot of trust to make it plausible to think that the next pandemic or the next unpredicted threat coming our way would not have very divisive consequences. And then, but I want to add something else into this, which is, we've mentioned it and we take it for granted, but the presence of so many guns. I mean, this is a really unusual society in terms of the number of guns that are
which makes the stochastic threat fatal. Yeah.
Right. You're right. Exactly. I mean, and I don't know of other. I mean, there are some small societies, I guess, where everybody has own guns, but there's certainly
Switzerland, maybe.
Right, but it fires. Their guns fire one shot.
Yeah.
So that I think that's another ingredient here that maybe isn't important, but it might be.
Yeah. The idea that we could maintain these huge differences, social, political, economic differences, and not have the temperature raised in a way that violence percolates seems like a stretch. And it's hard for me to think about what that world is like, because almost I characterize for my whole political consciousness, which is basically kind of from Carter to first term Obama, that period was I think of as a period of very high consensus at the elite level in American politics. I mean, the difference between the Clintons and the Bushes is French vanilla and vanilla ice cream. It's been since 1976, I think, that this will be the first election since 1976 in which a Bush, a Carter, or a Bush, a Biden, or a Clinton hasn't been on the ticket in some way, in a presidential ticket. But it is this period of enormous consensus in which the parties agreed on much more than they disagreed about. And now we're just in this very different context of disagreement. And so in one way, it's no surprise that we don't have the muscles to deal with that intense level of disagreement because we just hadn't had it for decades and decades. But I don't know if we can have the muscles to deal with it without, you know, in a way that eliminates the political violence.
Right. When I first began teaching, I was teaching the U.S. History Survey course, and it was right at the beginning of your period. It was Carter. I first began full-time teaching in 1977. You know, I no longer do this, but for decades I would periodically teach a U.S. History Survey course. And when we got to the post-World War II period, after you know we would start in Reconstruction and then go, you know, and then the 1930s. But then when we got to the talking about more recent efforts, I had a lecture that I had written called "The Essential Permanence of the New Deal and Civil Rights," because that's what it looked like.
Yeah.
And I continued.
It was right before the Reagan Revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But even the Reagan Revolution didn't really unravel it institutionally that much. But as the years went by, I began crossing off more and more sentences in that lecture, and eventually I crossed off the title. Yeah. Because I did no longer trust that that you could talk about you could make an argument why the changes wrought by the New Deal and by the Civil Rights Movement had to remain permanent.
Yeah. What do you think about legal strategies for containing the violence? So I think maybe on the more hopeful side, from leadership and institutionally, the levels of political violence and threat, at least in the modern period, last few decades, are relatively novel. And so maybe there's all of this low-hanging fruit for ways to deal with that violence that we just haven't picked yet. So for instance, a tiny example and then a slightly larger one. So I was in Madison, Wisconsin about maybe a couple of years ago, and a friend of mine had set up this meeting with poll workers who are the town clerks in Madison, because they knew I was interested in elections. And they said, well, you can talk about anything you want, but don't talk about political violence, because since 2020, these people have received all sorts of threats and they're in kind of a PTSD. It's like they don't want to talk about it. And then I was talking to a lawyer for the city after that meeting, and I said, have you guys, what about the laws on the books? Could the state of Wisconsin pass a law that made it increase the punishments on threats to poll workers? That would never happen because the legislature wouldn't be for it. And then so we let it go. But then a few weeks later, I got an email from him and he says, hey, we've passed a city ordinance that increases the penalties for that in order to protect public workers and especially poll workers. And in Colorado recently, and I think 20 other states, they've passed state-level laws to protect election workers. So maybe we've seen the violence increase and we're about to see some innovations in steps to contain that violence through law enforcement and other kinds of methods.
I mean, look, I'm all for such methods, right? I'm all for such methods, and I'm all for doing, what we can. But those methods, those approaches, those issues are, in effect, expressions of a commitment to democracy.
Yes.
Right, and a commitment to democratic institutions.
Deciding things together, yeah.
Right, and democratic institutions, and saying democratic institutions means having free and fair elections. Yeah. And so we want to implement these laws so that we can have free and fair elections, and that should decide who rules or who governs. Rules is not quite the right word, but we should decide who governs. I think that the issue that we face at one level, if we take seriously some of the analyses that we have about what the current nature of American politics is and what the current polarization and why democracy is at stake, in this election, the issue is that there seems to be a sizable proportion of the population or the electorate that is not committed to democracy.
Yeah.
And if you're not committed to democracy, and if you're not, I mean, the alternative to democratic processes for changing leaders is violence, right? Yeah. And if you're not committed to a democratic process, then I'm not, and if the number of people who lack that commitment stays the same or continues to go up, then I think that these measures will look like Band-Aids.
Right.
Right. Although I heartily approve of it.
Right. We should have them anyway. I actually think it's very hard to be a small d Democrat, just as a human being, because I kind of think it's an unnatural state, because we all have these things that we're very, very deeply committed to, whether it's a woman's right to choose or life begins at conception. A couple centuries ago, it was the Catholics versus the Protestants. These days, it may be the urgency of climate change, or no, let's not have any regulation and innovation will take care of it. And what democracy requires all of us to do is to be willing, in case we lose, to put those deep, deep commitments not quite on the back burner, because I'll still try to persuade you of my views, etc. But I know I'm not going to get my way for 4 years or whatever, maybe longer. And so democracy is incredibly demanding under any circumstances. And, in this high consensus period, that the demanding nature of democracy, it just wasn't evident because of the consensus. But when there's so much polarization, it puts a huge amount of strain on the willingness to lose, because it feels existential, and it may be existential. And so, I mean, for me, that's why the polarized times that we're in put such strain on democracy. And on the other hand, not on the other hand, and I agree with you, the alternative to democracy is that the person with the bigger club or the more guns wins and gets to decide, and that doesn't go well. So I think to all of the people who are entertaining non-democratic resolutions, they're just not taking seriously what that looks like, is how I feel. And I think it is hard to take seriously what it looks like if you've been blessed, as you and I have been, to live in a functional democracy for most of our lives.
Well, one important point, in this conversation, I think that you and I would agree with, is that political violence is the opposite of democracy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And thus is intolerable in a society which has democratic institutions.
Yes.
And thus, I think for a lot of us, and it's what we do at the Ash Center, is trying to preserve democracy in those institutions. The perverse bright spot that I would offer, looking at the future, because I'm not so confident about what's going to happen in this election, and I can say that I'm not overly optimistic about what's going to happen to political life in the United States in the next 5 to 10 years. I think things may get very grim. But that said, and again, as someone who teaches a course on the long history of democracy, even if things turn out badly from my point of view and your point of view in this coming election, or in politics in the next 10, 20 years, and the society becomes more oppressive and less participatory, the impulse towards democracy will not die and will not be suppressed in a population. And thus, what we may be looking at, there was a vision for a while during this consensus period that you spoke about, and it had various formal and informal, forms, that, well, democracy with a certain kind of economy, et cetera, it's here to stay and it's permanent, and that's the way it will always be. And certainly Americans believe that, this is the way we've been for more than 200 years. Et cetera. But it may be that what the future might look like is democracy interrupted from time to time, but then restored.
Yes. Yes.
and perhaps when restored will be stronger and more institutionally sort of flexible and expressive than it was in the past.
I hope that maybe the prospects for restoration don't require an interruption. Maybe they just require a palpable level of dysfunction that we already see. And so to the extent that it does create a basis of hope for me that, I mean, both parties and the system, I think, has proved pretty unresponsive recently. Nobody really wanted to see another Biden-Trump contest, and now there's not gonna be, but the Democratic Party itself proved very unresponsive to the desire not to have Biden be at the top of the ticket. And you could say, you know, slightly different but similar things on the Republican side of things. And so with unresponsive parties, political institutions that are unresponsive in lots and lots of different ways, I think it creates the desire and thirst for political reform that I do believe would create more possibilities for deals and agreements and negotiation and reconciliation than the current polarized two-party system. And we see this in public opinion polls. I think something like 2/3 of people want more than two parties. Something like 2/3 more want to reform the Electoral College. So up and down the board, people want a better democracy than they have right now in the United States. And so my hope is that they'll get that sooner rather than later.